Hello and welcome. The tense relationship between science and religion has hit another peak with the Vatican's hardline new document on bioethical issues. The doctrine, called Dignitas Personae, or the dignity of a person, updates the Catholic Church's position on abortion, condemning in vitro fertilization and other common procedures to help couples have children. It also denounces the so-called morning after pill, which women can use after sexual intercourse to prevent pregnancy. The bottom line, according to the Vatican, is that human life is sacred from the moment it's an embryo. Critics accuse the Church of trying to stop technological innovations and life-saving medical breakthroughs. It's said that science responds to our need to understand the world, and religion responds to our need for the world to have meaning. Today we ask, can the Church and biotechnology find common ground in the 21st century? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. Log on to livestation.com/AJE, enter the chat room and then take part. We also welcome your phone calls on the show. Joining me to discuss the issues is Dr. Jennifer Michael Hecht, who teaches philosophy at the New School at New York. She is the author of Doubt, A History, which is a worldwide study of religious doubt. Her other books include The End of the Soul. She's joining us from New York. And in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, we have Reverend Tadeusz Pacholczyk, the Director of Education at the National Catholic Bioethics Center. Father Tad earned a doctorate degree in neuroscience from Yale University before studying theology and bioethics in Rome. I welcome both of you.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Father Tad, if I could start with you and ask, why did the Vatican feel the need to issue this document at this stage? Why now?
Well, because there are a number of issues that the Vatican has dealt with before with respect to modern developments in biotechnology, but it has not covered all of the developments. In other words, there have been about 20 years or so since the last major document of this sort was issued. And in that intervening span of 20 years, a good deal has occurred. And the thrust of this document is to stress that the most important consideration here is that good science be properly understood always as ethical science. So that's kind of the launch point, and really is not significantly different from the formulations used in the prior document back in 1987.
So, Father Tad, essentially the basic doctrine is the same. It's just a response to perhaps new developments. That's the core of it, is it?
That's correct, yes. That we have new developments such as stem cell research, the certain new techniques in assisted reproduction that have been developed, and some of them are rather complicated in terms of even the mechanical details of how they are carried out. And the Vatican wants to provide further guidance on these issues, recognizing the importance of them, recognizing also that certain decisions have been made in our society already that have taken us a certain distance down this path and raised certain then lateral problems. For example, the freezing of human embryos, which put us into a kind of awkward situation now where people are wondering, how do we get out of this mess that we have created by having gone this far down the slippery slope?
Well, Dr. Hecht, if I could ask you, what do you make of the human dignity document that's been issued by the Catholic Church?
Well, it's very interesting. I think that I'm an atheist, and I believe that the big swell of atheists who've been writing today have been too much invested in science and not enough interested in ethics, metaphysics, and poetry and art as sources of meaning. And I think when you have the perspective that I do, it seems obvious that we do have to ask a lot of ethical questions, and that many times science does get out ahead of our ability to really think about it. The problem is that the Church, I think, is worried about a slippery slope issue, which means that it's starting way, way beyond where most people are. So the majority of Catholic people seem to be disregarding the injunction against contraception. Well, and so it's a real question about whether or not whether it makes sense to ask people to feel guilty about something they're going to do anyway, and in many cases that's the case.
Well, Dr. Hecht, I ask you to respond to an email that we got in from Laurie Manamar, who wrote in saying, any religion has a very important place in society, teaching and upholding ethics and keeping the ethics in these discussions, but they do not have the authority to decide alone what is unethical research and what is not. Now, isn't it important for Catholics and other people of religious faith to have some kind of very definitive guideline from their church on such issues?
Yeah, I think it is. And as a secular humanist, I believe that, say, suicide is against what the community needs. And I think that we can come out and say there are some things that are against what we ethically believe. And if Catholics want to listen to the Pope, that makes sense to me. If they've decided that that's to whom they're going to turn for ethical help, that makes sense. Everybody needs ethical help, and I'm more on the side of those people who are interested in it than those people who would sweep it away and say, let's just do everything and see what happens. Nevertheless, when the Catholic decision is, first of all, really, it's a separate group of essentially celibate, non-domestic men making decisions that really affect a great many people. I have to say my sympathies are with the great many people. But then there's a question of the rest of the world and whether they're influencing it so that people can't get services that they deserve. And that's a crime.
Okay, well, let me ask Father Tad here then. Who's involved in coming up with the document, Father Tad? You know, in terms of, if you have any idea, the consultancy involved, and whether or not outside experts, doctors, for example, and sort of neutral parties, if you could call them that, are involved in the informing of those who make the final decision on the document?
Oh yes, definitely. I think that Jennifer's characterization of this as being simply an exercise by a group of celibates is, of course, a vast oversimplification and is not at all sensitive to the extensive consultation that goes back not just years but sometimes decades in writing these important church documents. But the Pope went against. And the issue here, when she says that the issue is simply one of a slippery slope, we need to recognize that that actually is not simply the root of the argument, that the Church is identifying certain goods of the natural law. These are things that actually don't depend on a specific religious revelation. In other words, these are things that men of goodwill can sense, right and wrong.
But they can only do when they're in a one value orient.
Right. Sorry, Dr. Hecht, I'll let you respond. I was just going to ask you to just hang on till Father Tad finished. But go ahead. What's your response, Dr. Hecht?
Oh, well, that there are different values in the world, and I believe that it is of great value to recognize that different people have different ones. So there are some people who believe that sex within marriage is a beautiful, wonderful thing and that it should be propagated. And the idea that some very few people have this decision that people, even within a marriage, married people, should not have sex except when they're procreating or using a rhythm method, which is only as good as it is, that's really that is actually a moral prejudice which no philosopher could possibly stand with. There are different decisions about what the best good thing is. And when a mother decides she wants to have 3 children and that they should be two years spaced or so she can actually take care of them, that is a meaningful decision. And that she wants to make love to her husband in the meantime, I think that it's hard to argue that's a universal decision of good, don't you think?
Let me ask you, Father Tad, in what way can the Church be flexible to take into account some of the arguments Dr. Hecht is putting forward? Is there a need for the Church to be flexible?
Oh, there certainly is. The Church, for example, when we bring up the issue of stem cell research, has indicated, you know, the widest degree of flexibility imaginable, in the sense that it looks at this issue, identifies that there are real goods that have to be safeguarded, namely young human beings who are embryos, but other forms of stem cell research can be vigorously encouraged and promoted. So the Church, when there's new developments, for example, 1 year ago there was a massive breakthrough in the scientific community that dealt with producing stem cells directly from skin cells, good old-fashioned fibroblasts. And when they did this, this did not involve any embryos at all. So it was a new technology that had never existed prior to about a year ago, and the Church recognized immediately that this was going to be something that was ethically acceptable because it did not depend on the destruction of younger human beings by older and more wealthy and more powerful human beings who are pursuing the embryonic stem cell research agenda. So the Church is very flexible here and really is seeking to work always with an eye towards the real goods that will allow science to be a force that builds up society rather than threatening its future. The issue ultimately becomes one of, in medical research, aren't there dangers of ultimately subjugating some human beings for the benefit of others? And the whole discussion about embryos centers on that central realization that we have such powers at our disposal. We are obligated in good conscience to look closely at those powers so that we do not allow them to erupt in our hands and become forces via which we violate the younger and weaker members of our own human species.
Father Tad, a very quick question though for you. In terms of calling it the Dignitas Personae or human dignity document, that sounds quite loaded, as if those who don't pursue or follow that doctrine perhaps are ignoring human dignity.
Well, I think that it raises the question. You're right that it puts the question front and center, but you know, it needs to do exactly that, because when we stop for one moment and just ask the question, how did we ever get to the position of 400,000 frozen human beings just in the United States? You realize that human dignity, the dignity of the person, has been violated systematically, routinely, and in multiple instances, really in every major city of the United States of America. So we face a situation where these questions have to be raised with a certain intensity because consciences have already become very dulled around these topics. People have lost touch, if you will, with the basics here. The Church's document is a call back to certain very foundational truths. The realization that all humans should be treated the same. There should be no discrimination based on age or size. Just because you happen to be young, you should not be discriminated
I'm going to pause there. Dr. Hector, I'm going to ask you to hold fire with your response for just a second. We've got to take a very short break now, but we'll have more of our discussion in a moment. As we pause, let me remind you, you can join the conversation with your questions and comments. Log on to livestation.com and into the chat room. You can see the debates taking place in there right now. And we'll be right back.